Welcome to Dear Watchers, an omniversal comic book podcast where we usually do a deep dive into the multiverse.
We are traveling with you through the stories, the worlds, and with the creators that make up an omniverse of fictional realities we all love. And your watchers on this journey are me, Guido.
And me, Rob. And before we introduce today's interview, what's new in our little section of the multiverse, Guido?
Let's not spare any time. Nothing's new this week. So
same old.
Let's get on with our really exciting guest that we've been waiting a long time to have on.
And joining us on today's podcast is the amazing comic book and TV writer, Tim Sheridan. Guido, as you said, this has been a long time in the making, right?
Yeah, and we have a full introduction to Tim's work if you're not familiar once we get started in our conversation with him. We first met, you might remember, if you listened to our New York Comic Con coverage back in October. If you're feeling nostalgic for New York Comic Con, go back and listen to it again. In fact, saying that makes me think I kind of want to listen to it again. So it feels like we're there because we are kind of at the halfway point. No, I guess not yet. 2 months from the halfway point. Anyway, we met Tim and co-creator of Alan Scott Green Lantern, Cian Tormey, who couldn't join us at New York Comic Con, but Tim's work extends well beyond Green Lantern, and we are going to get into it, and finally it's here, and I have a feeling he's going to be back after today again, because there is some great work coming from him that we'll want to talk about.
Yeah, I can't wait to talk more to him, but his two latest projects are with characters and worlds that we both have long experiences with, like you said, Alan Scott, the Green Lantern, and also Masters of the Universe. He worked on the new Revelation TV show, and
we're not going to spoil too much of those, I'd say. We would have liked to, but of course we know that TV shows are quite protective of what's going on. So we talk about He-Man generally. So if you haven't watched those series, don't worry. You can still join in this conversation. Same thing with Alan Scott Green Lantern. We do get a little bit more into the specifics of that, but still broad strokes. So if you haven't yet explored those, you can join us, and I bet you'll want to watch and read those by the time this conversation's done.
And what's one thing, Guido, that you're taking away from today's conversation? For me, I think it's that Tim talked a lot about not adding on top of a character, but rather going into their history and pulling things out. So with Alan being a queer character, he's not like putting that queerness on him, but he's going back into the history and seeing, oh, where was that in the past and where can I pull out? And the Alan Scott series is full of these kind of deep cut DC references that have always been there that Tim's kind of bringing to the surface now. And it made me want to go back and read some of that classic Alan Scott and see where the seeds of that character really started with.
Yeah, it was funny to hear him talk about doing that, and because he even used that as a way to explain why he's actually not a fan of multiversal storytelling a lot of the time is in part because it doesn't do that really good storytelling. And I think we've talked about this. Really good multiversal storytelling can do this, which is pull that DNA out and shed it in a new light, which is really cool to hear him explore. And something I have been thinking about is our conversation about fans' relationship to stories and how they might feel some sense of ownership over them and where that might come from historically, evolutionarily, with the change in how we consume content and how comics have always been something fans feel possession over because they're something you can buy, they're something you can hold, they're something you can control the pace of. And so talking through that double-edged sword of fans' relationship to stories was really interesting and barely scratched the surface, but was great to hear Tim's insight into as a creator who's interacted with a lot of fans.
Yeah, it's making me think the day this is coming out, the Super Bowl was the day before, and whoever wins the fans always say, "We won," but you're not on the team, but you have that ownership over the team. And I think there's a same kind of relationship with fans of comic books and TV shows. They have that same kind of connection of really being part of it.
Yeah, it's clearly all very human, just a human thing. And so it's fun to explore those aspects of being human. So let's cut in because I don't want to take away any more time from our chat with Tim.
Yes, with that, dear watchers, welcome to episode 127, and let's check out what's happening in the Omniverse with our travels to today's interview. Great Scott, or should I say, Great Ellen Scott, it's our guest, Tim Sheridan. Hi, Tim.
Hi, thank you so much.
Welcome.
My voice cracked on the first syllable that came out of my mouth. You're like, it's audio only. I'm like, I got this. And then voice cracked, first syllable. Hi.
Oh, welcome.
I'm so glad we're
excited to
finally
have you.
doing this. We talked about doing this back at like New York Comic Con.
Yes,
And
October.
so apologies, but I guess
You've been busy.
Life gets in the way, and it's nice because now we actually have so much of your work out in the world to talk about, which is really exciting.
Great.
So
Let's talk about my work. Me.
Well,
Not
you can
everybody
just
else.
listen about yourself for a moment because
Sure.
I'm going to tell our listeners who you are. They know from our New York Comic Con episode that you were the highlight of my New York Comic Con. So
my God.
thank you for joining because you are a storytelling legend already, at least to
Blech.
us. And I know that makes you sound older than you are, but that's not the intent.
You have no idea.
So Tim has written Teen Titans Academy, Shazam, and a number of other DC books, is the co-creator of the Alan Scott The Green Lantern series, an extraordinary tale that's coming out now that I think we're going to dive a lot into today. Issue 5 is out at the end of February, can still be ordered for sure. And I will say I noticed that some issues had of 6 and DC removed it. So I'm extremely hopeful that there's more and extremely upset that DC does not have consistent trade dress. But moving on from that.
I can't wait to talk about that.
Tim also has written for a lot of TV shows, the Dragon Age TV series, the Transformers show, DC Superhero Girls, Teen Titans Go, wrote the Batman Long Halloween animated films, a few other Superman and other DC films. Most important to my heart and soul, Masters of the Universe, Revelation and Revolution, the first 2 seasons of the Netflix requel or whatever we're calling it. And Tim is just a generous, creative, revolutionary storyteller. And so we are very excited to welcome Tim Sheridan.
Well, thank you for that rousing introduction. Man, I feel like, I only really started like doing this really for real in about like late 2015, 2016, something like that. So it's like, I feel like when I hear those credits, it's wild to me that I've gotten to work on so many things that have meant so much to me since I was a kid. I grew up such a huge fan of Transformers, and I got to work on that show for Netflix. He-Man, getting to work in the DC universe is unreal. I was a DC kid almost from the start. I think actually before I got into DC as a kid, I was watching cartoons like Spider-Man and His Amazing Friends, or Spider-Man and His Amazing Furniture, as I call it. Anybody who watches that show knows what I mean. And so that was, but so it's incredible when I hear, I don't take a lot of time to like look at my IMDb, when I see it, it's like, oh man, that's a lot. Maybe I should retire. I feel like I've gotten to do so much. We were talking before we started recording about Doctor Who, and I'm like, that's why I don't retire, because there's still like a couple of white whales out there like Doctor Who and Star Trek that I've never gotten to work on. So maybe someday.
That's what's so cool about your career and your work, and so much of what we want to dig into, because obviously our podcast is all about world building. That's why we explore multiverses, to think about how people construct worlds and then how you can deviate from them to tell really good stories. And you get to play in all these sandboxes. So you get to constantly tell stories that have canon and that have a history, and you have to then make a lot of decisions about what you're going to do with that. Are you going to build on it? Are you going to retcon it? Are you going to do something different and hope people accept it? Like,
Some
that's
of that,
amazing.
I mean, some of that is, it's true that you get to like blue sky and dream really big in these situations. But I think what a lot of, it's funny because I think this is true of a lot of comic book fans. I don't think there's a large number of comic book fans that don't really understand the, because nobody's ever explained it to them or shown it to them, the sort of hierarchy and the way things work. I mean, I hear all the time, from people who will either praise or condemn writers for everything. And, we're just people working at a job, and there are layers and layers of people above us in companies like Warner Brothers and DC or Netflix, and we don't just get to do what we want. We may have
Hmm.
opinions and ideas, and we might pitch big ideas, but we don't always get to do them. It's it's everything we do has to be approved and sanctioned by the powers
Hmm.
that be. So, yeah, it's wonderful to get to play in those sandboxes and dream big. But part of our job is to know how to be able to play in the sandbox with everybody else who we have to play with on the playground, which are the
Hmm.
executives
Hmm.
and
Hmm.
the editors and the showrunners and everybody else that is involved in the game. I would love to just sit here and take credit for Masters of the Universe, Revelation, and Revolution, but that's Kevin Smith's show. He's the showrunner, and we've got Teddy Biaselli at Netflix and Rob David at Mattel, and these guys are like this triumvirate of these incredible producers. And I'm just happy to have a seat at the table and be able to, write and pitch ideas at them, and be a part of that story.
Hmm.
But everything we do in entertainment, comic
Hmm.
books, TV, movies, everything. It's a team sport.
Hmm.
I'd love to just take credit for everything, and I hate taking all the blame for everything. But 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 the truth is, it's a team sport, and some of us just kind of get out there and become a face of something for fans. And I think that I think we do them a disservice because they think that we have this unilateral power to change everything, or make everything the way we want to, which we can do. By the way, comic book fans I think feel that way because when you do a creator owned book, of course you
Hmm.
do. You own it. It's your IP. You get to do whatever you want. It's very, I mean, to an extent.
Right.
But when you're playing in someone else's sandbox, playing with established IP, it's a tightrope walk sometimes.
Hmm.
Um, and it's not just with the executives and the producers and the people that you work for and with, but also with fans. Fans
Hmm.
expect certain things from certain properties. I think there was, I don't want to talk too much about any of the I mean, there was a lot of there are a lot of people that were saying negative things about Masters of the Universe Revelation before it came
Hmm.
out and right after it came out. And it was, I think, some of it, was because they just expected something different because they had an idea in their head, and they had a head canon, and they had a way that they would approach doing the show. And that's a really tough, line to walk. I don't think any of us had any idea that there would be anyone who would be like, well, this isn't what I wanted. Because we were a bunch of nerds who loved He-Man and Masters of the Universe, and we were like, well, this is what we want. And it was
Hmm.
the same thing with I think with Alan Scott too when that came out. There were some naysayers, some people who had, you know, uh, they had political opinions, and they wanted to sort of lash out at the book before it came out, and try to tank it before it ever hit the shelves. And and some of them had those intentions, and then there were some people who genuinely whether it's right or wrong, just didn't like where DC had taken the character in recent years, and they wanted to reject that. I just feel like if you reject it, whatever, go read something else. Like, you don't have to talk about it, you don't have to tweet about it, you don't have to yuck someone else's yum. I mean, other people like it, so like, sorry, but
Yeah. I
there's plenty
remember
of comic books.
it was actually at this year's New York Comic Con, and I think I've always had that thought, but really at Comic Con, which for me is a very moving and emotional experience all the time, but it's also such a good reminder to me, not everything is for me. Because there are so many
Yeah.
incredible artists there. There are these panels. There are people who love these things that I just don't like. And that's okay. And I really love that I'm around a bunch of people who all love something that's connected, but we love different things for different reasons. And that's okay. It's not all for me.
I quote this all the time, and I'm probably totally bastardizing it by now because I've said it so many times. But Ted Sarandos of Netflix was on a podcast, and he just it was the most incredible thing I'd ever heard about entertainment, and it's very interesting coming from the guy who runs Netflix. He said that the way we as viewers consume movies is different today than it was when we were kids, where back in the day the movie was in charge. You had to show up on time. You had to leave your house, show up on time somewhere, sit quietly in the dark with a bunch of other people. You couldn't get up to go leave without missing stuff, to go to the bathroom or go to the concession. And you were looking at something that was literally larger than life in front of you. It was huge. It had the control and the power over the viewer. And now, we watch movies on small screens in our living room. It's smaller than real life. We have a remote in our hand. We can stop it and start it whenever we want. We can get up, we can leave, we can do whatever. So we have control over it in a way that it is bound to influence our opinion about a thing when we feel that we have dominion over it, when we feel that, well, this is mine. I am entitled to stop, start, control it, whatever. So if I don't like what I see, how could you do that to the thing that I love that is mine? And I think comic books were the harbinger of that, because comic books, you were always able to, it was always smaller than you, and you could always put it down and pick it back up, and you had sort of control over how you experienced the story.
And you own it.
Yeah, and I think that so it's not anybody's. It's not like it's. I'm not forming an opinion about this. It's just I think it's, to me, it's just a fact that we experience comic books in the way that we're now experiencing movies in our living rooms. And I think that leads to us feeling a sense of entitlement is the wrong word, but more invested in the results and the product than we might have been at a time when we had 3 channels on TV and we were just like, whatever I can get, I will put in my eyeballs because give me new shows, Now it's just, there's so much there that not everything's for you, and you can choose something else.
Yeah. Well, and that sense of ownership is, of course, such a double-edged sword, because it's why there is this community with such a deep emotional connection and investment, and also why there is the other side of the community of people who think they can direct it or should be able to direct it or want a particular need or agenda met by it. And so it is a
It
double-edged
runs
sword.
the gamut. And social media is, guilty for a lot of stuff too. I mean, everybody's a critic now. There used to be a time when critics were people who, studied the media and went to school even, and, could really analyze something from an educated perspective. And I think now, I mean, the adage has always been everyone's a critic, but not everyone had a microphone and a megaphone before. That's the difference. Everybody was a critic, but nobody had a way to amplify their criticism. Now they do. And so it's changed the landscape and the dynamic really since I really got into this. It's been happening even when I started. My first real job in TV was like in 2015, 2016. And, even since then, it has evolved and in some cases devolved in terms of how we deal with media over social media, you know.
For
As
sure.
as a
So
creator, I mean, not the trolls out there, but are you at all ever listening to the critics and saying, "Oh, they make this point," and is that ever affecting your work?
I mean, I love, this is going to sound strange, but I love really smart criticism and really good notes. You know, whether it's from my editors or my showrunner, or whether it's from an executive, or if it's from a critic or a reviewer, or even a reaction from a fan. You know, like, I just have great respect for really good, smart, insightful criticism of what I've done. Because let me tell you, nobody is a bigger critic of anything I've ever done than me. And so it is, so you can't really hurt me because believe me, I've already gone through it. I put myself through it. But, but, so I love it. What I don't love as much is lazy critique that, you know, where it's kind of ill-informed, you know, even if it's, and I hate to say this, but even if it's positive, you know, there was a piece that just came out. I won't name the site, but where they anchored the whole thing around the fact that Tim Sheridan, had added this idea, this concept of a power of time travel to Alan Scott, and that's just ill-informed. Like that, this has always been something that Alan Scott has had, you know, power over. It's been part of his power set. Not every writer, not every editor has dealt with that, but it's always been there. And you know, so I just feel like that's, like, do your research, you know.
Yeah.
Like, I mean, this is a weird thing to say, but I mean, I get credit or blame all the time on the Alan Scott book for, like, how I've changed the canon or done something to, you know, and I don't, I don't think I've this is, like I said, a weird thing to say, but I don't think I've added anything to Alan Scott's story that isn't already, that someone else didn't do before me, that isn't, you know, referencing something someone else did. Or what I came in to do was to sort of take the toys where they were and put them together and play with the toys, and give you the story that we've kind of been waiting for a little while now. And you know, obviously there are things that are new going on in this story. The Golden Age Red Lantern is a new character, but you know, he was created by Geoff Johns. Like, that came out before we learned about him before the Alan Scott book. You know, so I think, you know, I don't like saying, "Oh, I haven't done a thing to add to Alan Scott's lore, canon, or story," you know, but but that was kind of the assignment in my mind. I was like, "Look, I'm not here to break the toys. I'm here to play with the toys. That's what I want to do, and I'm not going to try to upend everything and change everything." Am I shading things? Am I adding new layers to it? Yeah. Am I making connections that maybe weren't made before? Yeah. It always bugged me that when Alan Scott has these weird powers, and one of them is he can walk through walls, and it always bugged me because he always called it moving through the fourth dimension, and we know that now. We always think of the fourth dimension as time, and it just drove me nuts for years that, you know, it's the idea of the fourth dimension. So I was like, well, how would that work if it was related to time travel? A power that he's, you know, a time manipulation, something that we know he's had, you know, as part of his power set before. How would that work? And so I tried to make a connection and explain it in the book. That's not really adding to anything. That's just sort
Right.
of me, you know, saying, here's the, by the way, it also came out of the mouth of a very unreliable narrator of the Red Lantern. So who's to say that another, you know, editor or creator is going to come down the line and say, yeah, he was lying, you know?
Right, and
I don't know.
re-clarify. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't
Well,
know.
I think that's what some of the best stories of these properties that have been around for so long do, is they're taking these strands of the DNA and they're just combining them a little differently, or shading them, as you said, a little differently, putting their voice into it. And I think that's what's so interesting about the fact that so much of your work has been in these pre-existing properties. For Alan Scott specifically, what is your history with Alan? Were you a fan of his?
Well, we
You said
dated
you
for
were
a
DC
time,
kid.
and it was just funny. What's your
Well,
history?
his lovers haven't turned out too well, Tim. Like
I
there's
know,
been some
you
issues there.
survived.
So
No, right? I know. When I pitched the story we had a little summit, and with Geoff Johns and Jeremy Adams, Rob Venditti, our editors, Andrew Marino, Marquise Draper, and Katie Kubert. And Katie, the group editor, when I was finished telling the story, pitching the whole story, issues 1 through 6, she was just like sitting there devastated, like her head was in her hands. And I was like, "Are you okay?" And she said, "Poor Alan. Does everyone he loves die?" I was like, "Well, not everyone." But that to me was it was an interesting thing to think about at the time, and it cemented the idea in my head that that is how this story has to begin, because for me, this is a story about a man coming out of the darkness into the light, and we had to start in a pretty dark place. And as you read the issues, as we've gotten through 4 issues now, I think we've gotten to a place where I think more of this. I think we talk more about this in issue 5, maybe. But you start to realize that some of the things that you didn't think were intentional before, were intentional, which is that, like, all the guys that that Alan was had any kind of relationship with, they all look suspiciously like Johnny Ladd, and that's more than just him having a type. And so yeah, I love watching people sort of put the pieces together as the issues move on. I mean, the whole thing was planned out, and so I knew that this is going to land in this issue, this is going to happen here, and people are going to not know what this means until this happens. And unfortunately, I think a lot of times when you do like this, in many ways, this was designed as more of a graphic novel than as a monthly, because I think there's a lot of folks now, because of streaming culture and because of the availability of trade paperbacks and collected editions, and a lot of people wait for those to come out to read a story, to read it in, as a complete thought. I think there's a lot of folks who aren't accustomed to the monthly storytelling idea, and who can get impatient and not want to wait a month to know what happens next, or God forbid 3 months to know what that meant in issue 1. But that's, in the end, I mean, that's comic books. And hopefully the problem is when you have an end date, when it's like, well, it's only 6 issues, so it's like, well, then I want to know everything. Like, tell me everything now. I don't want to have to see this thing strung out over 6 issues. Which you mentioned the trade dress. Like, where it's like issue 1 and then 2 of 6 and 3 of 6 and then issue 4 with no of 6. And I mean, let me just say, I was as surprised as you. When I got my comps for issue 4, I opened them, I was like, wait, like issue 1, I was like, okay, fine, they didn't do of 6. I don't love that, because I think it's good to tell people right out the gate, this is going to be 6 issues. But whatever, it's not my department. And then I was like, oh, but they fixed it. 2 of 6, then 3 of 6, and then 4 comes out, and I was like, oh, now everybody's going to think there's more coming,
So we shouldn't get our hopes up for this volume.
Yeah, let me tell you, not that nobody's talked to me about it. If there are, then somebody else is going to be doing it, and nobody's told me. So no, this story is 6 issues, and it was designed to be 6 issues, and hopefully we'll leave it in a place that will be surprising but satisfying, inevitable, and we'll leave the toys in a place where someone else can come in and tell some great stories with these characters in the future.
Is is it fun with Alan writing for a specific time period, because it's so interesting, being set in the 30s and 40s, so there's some tropes or some things that you probably wouldn't have access to, like modern technology, and there's a different kind of language. Do you think of that at all, like setting it in the time period?
Let me tell you the biggest hurdle for me. And Cian's been cool about it. Cian Tormey, my partner in this, um, you know, it's just that every time I need to introduce new information into this world and into this scene, I'm like, okay, I guess it's another newspaper. Because there's no there's, there's no cell phone, there's no social media. It's not like you're going to be watching it on television necessarily. I've you'll note that there's some information coming at you now through Doiby's radio in his car, which, by the way, was not always. They didn't all have radios, but dang it, Gertrude's got a radio, and and in issue 4, there's a family, gathered in the living room
Yes,
listening
I
to the
love
radio
that.
as there's
Those
some
panels.
information coming to you. Because I'm like, I just can't do another newspaper. I can't put another newspaper in here, because when you do a newspaper, it opens up a whole other thing where, like, is the artist going to letter the newspaper? Is the letterer going to letter the newspaper? Is it going to happen in-house at DC? Like, it's kind of like it's this game of hot potato that happens, and you kind of get through the process, and like sort of like everybody's not it, you know. And so I feel like, oh, there's got to be another way to put information into this scene, from the outside world.
Well,
So
and you
that's
had the Spectre
challenging.
too, who's like a character who I guess can kind of bring in information from the netherworld or
Omniscience.
You know,
wherever.
Yeah.
I look at the Spectre, and the reason why, a lot of people will be like, he's written out of character, and I'm like, well, yeah, that's the point. He literally tells you that he's out of character, in the book. Like, it's like Doctor Who. We were talking a little bit about Doctor Who. It's when, although you're new to Doctor Who, so you haven't necessarily gone through all this yet, but when the Doctor regenerates and becomes a new man, basically, there's a period where he's not quite done yet, and he's still cooking, and he's kind of, out there, and he's trying to put the pieces together of who he is. And I feel like that's where Jim Corrigan and the Spectre Force are at this point. He died in 1940, and this is early 1941. So he says, like, I only recently died and became an agent of the Almighty. You're not the only one having identity issues, he says to Green Lantern. And so there's that whole soup that's happening. But to me also, the Spectre is a force that should kind of, if not exist outside of time and space, at least sort of walk those lines, really dance on those lines. And so, there's an issue in Ostrander's Spectre run in the 90s, where they deal with the topic of homophobia. And you see Jim Corrigan, the Spectre, exhibiting very homophobic, behavior and ideals, and goes to the pearly gates, and he talks to Michael, and he wants to know, like these people are wrong, right? Like, what? And so there's a whole conversation that happens where basically Michael's like, that's not our business. We're after the killers and the murderers, and like, that's who God's vengeance is reserved for. So that, to me, that's literally what he tells Alan in issue 3 of Alan Scott. And so it is completely in character, except that happens in his timeline 50 years in the future. But to me, there's two ways to look at it. He's either sort of outside of time, and these ideas conflict and bounce around, and especially when he's cooking still, when he's just becoming this version of the Spectre Force. But also, there's also this idea, like, when you're new on the job and you do your job like perfectly to the letter,
Right.
because you know all the rules, and then, like, in 50 years after you've been doing your job a while, you kind of let things slide, and you have to be reminded, no, this is how you do your job. Like, to me, that's that's what, is also possibly happening in that scene.
Yeah. There stuff like that, like the lore, that issue even. When you're working on any project, but you could start with Alan, but feel free to go into anything, He-Man, anything. How are you approaching it? Are you using your own knowledge because you're clearly a fan of all of these properties? Are you doing research before you
Oh,
even pitch? Are you doing research after you pitch? Like, how do you get all of that in? Because there are a lot of little subtle nods in the Alan Scott story that it's just clear you're calling back to
this
things.
I'm so glad you redirected me back to your question, because I am the worst interview, because I will just keep talking and then realize, oh, I haven't answered your question at all. Um, I, 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 in terms of my relationship with Alan before writing this book, it was like most people's relationship with Alan Scott. I didn't grow up with Alan Scott because he wasn't really a main character in the books I was reading when I was a kid. There would be references to him. I remember the mystery of, wait, who is this blonde Green Lantern guy? Like, I don't know who this is. And because I think Hal Jordan was in cartoons when I was a kid, and I knew him as the Green Lantern. His costume was different. And it was, as I got older and was reading more comics, I understood more the Golden Age, and and the very confusing versions of the canon, or like, whether they existed or didn't exist, or whether it was another Earth, or whether timelines, and I don't know. There was just all kinds of different ways to look at it. Um, and But I never really was. I didn't gravitate toward Golden Age heroes, and I didn't gravitate toward Alan Scott. I remember when the Earth 2 book happened, and I was like, oh, he's gay in this, which is an interesting thing to do. I hadn't ever really considered it. There were a lot of people who read Golden Age Green Lantern comics and said, oh, this is coded, which I don't know. I mean, I don't. I never really read them that way, but I guess I can see it now. I think a lot of people, because the word queer gets used a lot,
Mm-hmm.
but it's the old meaning of, like, odd, like, is, but it gets used so much that I think a lot of people looked at it like, this is coded as queer. It's like, well, it's not coded. It literally is like queer,
Right, they're
as
using the
queer,
word.
but it means odd. But who knows? I mean, I don't know. I mean, there could absolutely have been some reasoning behind that. So anyway, I experienced, that was interesting. And then I started writing Future State and Titans Academy. Was my first comics I did at DC, after having worked in DC animation stuff for Warner Brothers, but the first time ever working with DC Comics, really. And and Alan Scott came out of the closet to his kids in, the Prime, universe, Earth, Prime Earth. And I was like, oh, okay, interesting. And I think, like everybody, I was like, oh, that's interesting, because his son Todd is gay.
Mm-hmm.
So that's an interesting dynamic that you don't see a lot. And I'm kind of fascinated to see where that plays out. I'm kind of one of those people. Like, you introduce new information about a character, and I'm like, oh, this will be interesting. I can see, maybe it's because I'm a storyteller or writer. Like, I'm like, oh, there's story possibilities here. Let's
Mm-hmm.
see where that goes. Rather than, wait, that's not the way it's always been. I'm like, who wants the way go back and read the way it's always been. Like, from now we get new possible stories here, new ways to go with it. So that was it. And then, so I still didn't really dive into the history of Alan Scott until uh, Geoff Johns. We were working on Flashpoint Beyond, and when we were wrapping up, Geoff called me and he was pitching me this idea for the new Golden Age, and some stuff that he thought we should do and we wanted to do. And he said, I think that you have an Alan Scott story in you, like in the 1930s and 40s. Like, what is that like for him? And as a closeted gay superhero during that time, and really arguably the most famous superhero in the world, at that moment. And then we started talking about, his idea for a Golden Age Red Lantern arch nemesis, And that's when I was just like, oh yeah, like I said, this is. And now that we have 4 issues out, we can talk about this, which
Yeah.
is, he's like, yeah, we were like, oh, I don't remember, I think he was like, oh, it'll be like the Soviets' answer to the Green Lantern, will be the Red Lantern. And I don't know which one of us said it, but I was like, yeah, but the history of Alan Scott is that he marries his enemies. he, he married 2 villains. I said, this to be Alan Scott, to be an Alan Scott story, this needs to be that needs to be a romantic relationship. It needs to be Batman and Catwoman. This needs to be that kind of thing. And even more than that, like Catwoman, I wouldn't say is Batman's arch nemesis, but let's dial it up even more. Let's have it be, what if Hal Jordan and Sinestro were boyfriends?
Yes. It does
And
feel like that.
yeah, so that really got me excited, and that's when I went in and really dove deep into Alan Scott lore, and I started at the beginning, and decided that this was all going to be rooted in the Golden Age and really specifically the Golden Age before, like just up until the formation of the JSA and before World War II. And while I know a lot about what is coming for Alan Scott down the line, I kind of divorced myself from it in the story, in building this story, because I want to know what Alan knows at this point. Like I want to sort of come at it from his perspective and not know everything that's coming down the pike. And and so that's kind of how I've approached it. So you'll see, like I really, really went back to basics in terms of the Golden Age and trying to make connections and explain things and give you a little bit more, some more layers and some more detail on why things happened the way they did for him in All American Comics number 16, and so forth.
Yeah. Well, similar to talking about Doctor Who before we were recording, reading your Alan Scott makes me want to take in more of the Golden Age. Because you're doing that, you're pulling those threads, you're bringing that in, even though that's something I have no connection to, have no relationship to, and in a vacuum would probably not have engaged. You're making me want to go back and absorb it because I'm so interested now in this story and this character and what you're doing with it.
That's the whole thing. Like I remember when I did the Long Halloween animated movies, I went out there when I was promoting them and I was trying to explain to people that I think there were a lot of folks who were like nervous about the movies, and they were like, what is this going to be? Why are you trying to replace the thing that I love? And I was like, but that's not what we're doing. We're not trying to replace a thing that you love. We're trying to celebrate the thing that you love and hopefully get you to go back and pick up that book again and read it. And hopefully these movies, will encourage more people who haven't read The Long Halloween to go pick it up and read it. And that to me, it's a celebration of it. So this book, hopefully Alan Scott is a celebration of the Golden Age and of Alan Scott's origins that'll get people maybe interested and go back. With DC, I was so happy they put out a facsimile edition of his origin comic, All American 16, the week that Alan Scott #1 came out. So, which is a great way to sort of come at, that story. You really kind of needed to read it too for issue 2, because I couldn't get into a lot of detail on some of the particulars of the origin, but we referenced them in issue 2. But it's like we were talking about before we started recording about Doctor Who, where watching classic Doctor Who is kind of an acquired taste. You there's so many people who grew up on it and who love it. And there's people who have learned to love it because of the new series. But the rubber mask monsters and the cardboard walls and stuff take a little bit of getting used to. The style, the way they told the story, like 5 acts, 20 minutes each every week, and every end of every 20 minutes, the doctor was about to die, or the companion was about to, or the assistant, as we said back then, was about to die, and so Golden Age comics to me are a lot like that, where you can read this book and it, I'm glad to hear that it's, exciting you to go back and experience and read Golden Age books. But I caution you that comic books in the Golden Age were very different animals
Yeah.
than
Oh,
they
yeah.
are today. So you can see why we tell these stories the way we do, why it's been so fun going back to the 30s and 40s with this story, because there's a huge opportunity to add in layers, and dimension and real world stakes to stories that when you read them, without really any historical context, they kind of all, a lot of the heroes all sound the same in those books. They're all, and they're supposed to, like, that was how they sold the comic books to kids.
Yeah.
He's just like,
Template.
he's just like Superman. He's just like Green Lantern. And but the villains are kind of all the same, the kind of stuff they're coming up against in the beginning, and then
Well,
it got more complex.
Alan's like cab driver is like the Shadows cab driver. Like they're exactly the same character that could exist in
Yeah,
like
the
a shared
sidekick trope.
universe.
Yeah, the sort of sidekick trope with Dorothy Dickles, although, and then I think, I hope people go back and read those books, find them, read them, and really get rooted in sort of the origins of all these characters, and then then hopefully they also appreciate that we're trying to sort of retell the story, not reboot, but retell the story with more layers and a modern perspective and a modern lens, and certainly in Alan's case, seeing him through the lens that we see him through now, understanding that this was a man who was dealing with a complex you know relationship with his sexuality at the time, uh, which is only going to, I think, by the end of this series, I think you're going to see how complex it is. I think by the end, we know the history of Alan Scott. We know the choices he made and the things he did up until he finally came out of the closet, in 2020 or 21 or whatever. And so there's a reason for that,
Yeah.
and I will just say this now, which is, if there's anything that I hope, anybody who's in Alan's position, who's reading this book, is reading it. If there's one thing I hope they take away, it's that it's okay. It's okay to not have it all figured out.
Yeah.
You'll
Yeah.
get there.
I think that's such an important message, and it definitely comes through in his story, which I love.
He certainly doesn't have it figured out. I think you can tell he's kind of a mess.
Yeah.
He's a little bit of a mess, which
Yeah.
is weird for a superhero. But this is an origin. It's early days, and we have to see him become the man he's going to be, the man who's going to shine a light for the whole world.
So as you mentioned, it's not a reboot. It's not. It's unified under the current Prime Earth Prime that we're in. I am curious, before we start to wrap up our conversation, what is your history with multiverses? Were you a fan of Elseworlds when you were growing up? Like, what? Yeah, tell us more about that.
I think it's funny. I think my first ever experience with the idea of a multiverse was Star Trek, Mirror Mirror. Like, the mirror universe in Star Trek was fascinating.
Yeah.
As a kid, I was like, what? There's this whole place where all these stories are happening, and I don't even know. The camera's not even pointed there. This is one of the great things about, like, later Star Trek in the 90s, when they would take you back to the mirror universe, and you learn a little bit more. And then certainly in like expanded universe books and things, we got to live in that a little bit. But so that was like my first real introduction to it. And then, because I didn't read Crisis on Infinite Earths until, oh gosh, I was a teenager, and which is funny because I'm such a, like, my entire career is, I think, inspired by, like, there should be on my tombstone, maybe it should say Tim Sheridan asterisk, and then based on a story by Marv Wolfman. Like, I think Marv Wolfman has done more to formulate who I have become in my life than than a lot of family members and things that other things that sort of raised me as a kid.
Oh, it's
Um,
incredible.
and so yeah, so I didn't come to Crisis until after I was like, oh, Marv did this, check that out. And so yeah, my relationship to it is I'm fascinated by those things. I do think the concept of the multiverse, I have notes about the very concept of a multiverse. I do feel like, while I understand that sometimes it's the only way
Hmm.
to let fans make sense out of divergent canons and different versions of the thing that you know and love. Sometimes it's the only choice you have, but it's all that doesn't mean it's not a little bit lazy.
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
multiverses are the quick and easy, quick and dirty solution. It's sort of the a wizard did it version of explaining different canons and different versions of canon. Um, so I think so. Anybody who comes in and tries to class up the joint in terms of a multiverse story, to really deepen it and add some layers to it and blow my mind with it, I'm into that.
Yeah.
That stuff I like. Like I'm crazy about Geoff Johns. Like I love everything that I think that he's done. I'm a
Me
fan.
too. Me too.
And so getting to meet him and work with him was the thrill of a lifetime. And becoming friends with him is the weirdest thing in the world. But I'm crazy about him, and which I didn't expect, by the way. I was like, oh, this will be someone who I will just sort of, still quietly worship, and 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 sort of occasionally have interactions with, and it's like, it's like Jeremy Adams and I were at the Bob's Big Boy at a restaurant one day, and Geoff texted and we're like, we're at Bob's Big Boy. He's like, I'm coming over, and he came over. He's like, this is my favorite place, So we're just hanging out.
Oh my gosh.
So anyway, so I love the stuff and then you'll see a lot of like what I'm doing with Alan Scott is Geoff has this way of taking these sometimes forgotten characters and heroes within this pantheon of characters and shining them up and
Yeah.
classing up the joint, like I say, and giving you a new spin on them and making connections that you never made before,
Yeah.
and because of his deep love of the whole history of comics
Hmm.
and especially in DC.
Yeah.
um
It's one of the
so
things that
I
makes
try to
Infinite Crisis one of my
emulate.
favorite things ever.
Yeah, me too. I love it because what it did was it took Crisis on Infinite Earths and it put a whole new spin on it,
Hmm.
and that's whereas Crisis on Infinite Earths was, you can see the functionality of it and how there was an assignment, and Marv and George knocked that out of the park, and everybody who worked on that book knocked it out of the park. Um, but Geoff, I think, came along and everybody who worked on Infinite Crisis and said, well, let's see if we can add more dimensions to this idea and give it a little form and not just be functional. And not that Crisis on Infinite Earths is only functional. It's just, I think that adding adding some more layers to it was a smart move.
Hmm.
And so I love stuff like that. And so I like that's so in terms of multiverses, that's how I feel about them. I want to do the kind of stuff that people like Geoff Johns does if I'm working in a multiverse, to try to make it a little bit, you know, make it a little bit more of a thinker than, which, by the way, is how Flashpoint Beyond started. Like Jeremy Adams and I had this idea for a story, and it ended up being it's not the story we ended up doing with Geoff, but Jeremy and I had this thing, and it kind of bumped up against the original Flashpoint. And when we were told we could do it, we're like, well, we don't want to do it unless Geoff Johns says it's okay to do a thing that's kind of going to bump up against Flashpoint. And they were like, oh yeah, well, we'll talk to Geoff. And then Geoff was like, this is great. Let's work on it together. And we're like, what? Having never met him, we were like, this is crazy. And then we just threw all that out and we started, the three of us did the thing together. But the story that Jeremy and I were pitching, we may still do someday. Who knows? Very much was like, let's take a multiversal concept and this idea of crises and things like that, and put put some new layers to it, put a new spin on it, and hopefully class up the joint. But you never know with us. You never know.
Well, I hope we get to see that one day. Is there Elseworlds or any alternate universe that's either a favorite of yours, or is there one that you wish you could tell or someone would tell?
It's so funny having gotten to write in the Flashpoint universe, because that would have been my number one. So
So
it's
maybe
like
just more stories in that world.
it's one more thing that, well, definitely. I actually have some pitches for some stories of that world, but I don't know that we're ever going back there. I have no idea. It's funny when I think about that, because that is so much in keeping with so much of my career, where I feel like, oh, I've gotten to play with the toys that I played with as a kid, and I've wanted to play. I mean, Flashpoint came out when I was not a kid, but still, like when I was younger than now, and I loved the thing. And now I've gotten to play with those toys, and I hope I get to keep doing that. I hope I never lose the wonder of that. That's the thing. Like once I do some Star Trek and Doctor Who, it's like, oh, well, I guess I'm done. I don't know what's next for me after
Yeah.
that. I mean, I'll just
Time
have to focus
time to
on
get that
creator and
Marv
stuff.
Wolfman gravestone ready then.
Based on a story by Marv Wolfman.
So
Based on a life by Marv Wolfman.
Have you gotten to meet Marv and you've become friends with Geoff? Have you gotten to meet Marv?
Yes, I gotten to meet Marv Wolfman, which was another wild thing that happened. Marv and I were working on a project together that,
Whoa.
unfortunately, because um, of all the kind of turmoil that's happened at Warner Brothers in DC over the past few years, in terms of like, Warner Brothers got, AT&T bought them, and then Discovery, and things were changing, things were shifting, editors were leaving the company and coming back, it was a whole thing. So that project went away because the editor who was the champion of it left the company. And but I got to hang out with Marv and work on a story together.
Wow.
Which is unreal to me. And he's the nicest man. I haven't seen him since I ran into him at the Shazam 2 premiere, and ruminated about what might have been had our story gone forward. But
Well, one
maybe,
day, or in some alternate
yeah.
universe, that story is getting released. But let's hope
You
one
and your
day here.
multiverses, you're just like obsessed.
Yes. Well, they give me hope, because that story will come out in another one. So,
Do you think if there was another universe that we could get to it, like in real life?
I have
Oh,
no
man.
idea. That's like what breaks my brain. So I have absolutely
Yeah.
no idea.
That's why you have to read about it. Yeah.
Exactly.
Okay. All right.
Yeah. And I agree. And I think we both agree with you totally that it's used lazily or as a shortcut a lot of times. But I think what appeals to both Rob and me most about it is when it's used.
Rob can speak for himself, You don't have to. Sorry. So what appeals to you?
We've talked many times on here about those times when in a lot of ways what you're describing, Geoff Johns does, when an alternate universe is able to add to the story that and it's able to bring something else in about that character or about that dynamic, that story that you love. It adds to it, and that's really rich. So
yeah, I don't think Doomsday Clock gets enough credit for that, which I think is just another great sort of version of Geoff, playing with the toys the way I want them to see them played with. I'm so selfish the way I experience these comics.
So can you share with our listeners what they should look out for from you next, and how they should keep on top of your work?
First of all, thank you. Alan Scott issues 1 through 4 are out now. If you can find a copy, I know it's been challenging. There've been a lot of, everywhere I go, people are like, oh, they didn't have any more issues. They didn't have any more copies. I'm like, well, tell them to order more. But issue 5 and 6, we're going to wrap up the story. So those are coming out soon. And Masters of the Universe Revolution 5 half-hour episodes, not 5.5 hours, but 5 half-hour episodes. It's about 2.5 hours ish, I guess. Are or more are out there on Netflix. So please check those out if you haven't, because I'm so thrilled by the reaction that that show has gotten. We make that show with so much love and so much, love for the characters and for the fandom and the fans that I think Revolution is, we're very proud of it, and I think people have really found something special in it, which is cool. Speaking of Revolution, you can pre-order now the Masters of the Universe Revolution prequel comic book from Dark Horse, with a story by producers from the show, Ted Biaselli and Rob David and me, and scripted by me, and with art by the amazing Daniel HDR. And so that'll be out May 15th. Issue 1 will be out May 15th. So please tell your shops, if you like Revolution, if you like Masters of the Universe, tell them you want a copy.
Yes, we have that pre-ordered, and every variant cover of that and Alan Scott. So we've got as many copies of your things as we can.
What an embarrassment of riches. I bet it was a weird way to end that. Like, I took a pause in the middle. What an embarrassment. What I'm trying to say is, what an embarrassment of riches it is on the covers on Alan Scott and Masters of the Universe. But these, I mean, not only the A covers by David Talaski, which every single one is better than the last one, and, as if that's possible, but the variant covers are unreal. The artists are incredible, and our editor Andrew Marino, he just knew exactly what to go for, and what would, I think, make this book really stand out on shelves. And I'm very grateful for that. How are we going to do the trade? What's going to be on the cover? Will it be issue 1? I don't know.
More importantly, I hope it's a hardcover. I won't hold out too much hope, because they're few and far between, but it deserves a hardcover. So that's
funny that you say that. They made hardcovers of Titans Academy Volume 1 and 2, and I was like, why? I'm like, I want to read the paperback. I think people like to have it on their shelf, and that's why they like the hardcover. But I'm like, no, I want to read it, and so the paperback is easier to read for me. But I have no idea. We'll see what they're doing. I think that'll be later this year, assuming that people still keep buying issues 5 and 6.
Yeah.
There's a world in which they're like, well, I guess we're not going to make a trade.
Maybe they'll time it with Pride season. Good release for Pride season.
Yeah, that would be fast though, I think, for them. I don't know. I'm hoping it'll at least be out by National Coming Out Day.
Oh, yeah, there you go. And New York Comic Con. Those are usually together in October. So
yeah, that'd be great.
We'll get you to sign it there. Well, thank you for your time, Tim. Everyone, please go pre-order those books and pick up the back issues.
Thank you so much. This has been really fun.
Wow, what a great conversation. And like you said in our intro, Guido, I can't wait to talk to Tim more.
Yes, I'm sure it's going to happen. It's inevitable. And for now, make sure you do those pre-orders. You track down Tim's work. You check out those comics. You watch Masters of the Universe. You pre-order that comic, which is coming out in the spring, written by him. And in the meantime, that is a wrap, Dear Watchers. Thank you for listening. I have been Guido.
And I have been Rob.
You can follow us on all social media at Dear Watchers, particularly Instagram and Threads, where we're most active.
Yes, and leave us a 5-star review wherever you listen to podcasts. We'll be back soon with another trip through the multiverse.
In the meantime, in the words of Uatu, keep pondering the possibilities.